Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. I Walked with a Zombie, 1943. For their second collaboration, producer Val Lewton and director Jacques Tourneur were keen to build on the overnight success of Cat People that had greatly exceeded studio and audience expectations. RKO's punishing release schedule, however, gave them no time for difficult second album musings. Lewton was contracted to deliver his next production less than 4 months later, as the second of 4 scheduled releases by the end of 1943. It would take a workaholic coupled with rare artistry to manage this workload, and yet still imbue each film with quality far beyond the typical cranked-out schlock. And that he was. I Walked with a Zombie, like its predecessor, shackled Lewton to a studio-forced title that he would need to work against, while at the same time somehow fulfilling. The zombie horror subgenre was also tarred with racist and cheap-jack connotations. Since it began with the dire White Zombie in 1932, as we've already seen, the only major studio picture to attempt a Caribbean voodoo-flavored horror was Paramount's The Ghost Breakers in 1940, which I've also covered earlier, and this was played for comedy as a Bob Hope vehicle. Whilst it gave us the first example of a nightmarish undead soul in Noble Johnson's unsettling Zombie, there was an uncomfortable imperialist racism embedded that tarnished all of the first decade's iterations. Indigenous West Indians who believed in the undead returning to life were exploited superficially as a primitive device for shocks, rather than as a culture to understand. There was no better treatment either for the black Western characters that accompanied the white heroes. Whether played by Willie Best in The Ghost Breakers or Manton Moreland in Monogram's awful King of the Zombies in 1941, they were as denigrated as the natives, but more sharply detailed as comic relief, wide-eyed, lazy cowards. By the early 40s, Monogram was in fact the only studio still churning out zombie pictures. This Poverty Row outfit was an ideal place for the living dead in more ways than one. Cost-wise, there was zero requirement for talent or extra outlay for costumes. All they needed were a few glassy-eyed shamblers who could be upgraded for a few dollars into monotone delivery day players. And if you've ever seen a Monogram film, there were plenty among the cast to choose from. Lewton and Tourneur worked hard to distance themselves from any association with past tawdry efforts in the field, unassisted by source material given to them by RKO bosses that was as much a hindrance as an inspiration. The film's title was taken from an American weekly newspaper article by Inez Wallace, essentially a fabricated rip-off of Walter C. Brooks' The Magic Island, itself a questionably lurid account of his own first-hand experiences of voodoo practices in Haiti, a book which I covered in more detail in my podcast on White Zombie. Although the veracity of Wallace's article could not be relied upon, in his superb history of undead cinema, Book of the Dead, Jamie Russell argued that the finished film mimics Wallace's uncertainty and hesitation, absorbing the inherent paradoxes between the clash of knowledge and ignorance found in the article. Tales of roaming zombified slave workers and black magic ritual were far too crude and flimsy for Lewton's refined taste when overseeing the screenplay by Kurt the Wolfman Siodmak and Ardell Ray. He rejected Siodmak's populist early drafts and instead asked them to ground any depiction of Haitian voodoo in genuine research, recalling the inspirational integrity of his mentor Selznick, and to use Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre as a blueprint for the emotionally engaging story. The result had more in common with Cat People than their shared quality beyond the call of duty. Like its predecessor, I Walked with a Zombie's strengths in plot, characterization, and brooding atmosphere meant that even with the supernatural element removed, it would still offer a gripping story of doomed love. Arguably, it is even more subtle. There are no murders or jump shocks, and even its single presumed figure of terror is ambiguous and sympathetic. There are emotive echoes of the Bronte novel's structure underpinning the film. We see events through a first-person narrative by a female character, Canadian nurse Betsy Connell, Frances D., sent to work as a carer in an unfamiliar environment, who cannot help falling in love with a tortured, reserved employer, Tom Conway. Both struggle to remain principled while haunted by his alive yet mentally disturbed first wife that she is treating. Events will ultimately reveal dark secrets that impact on everyone. I Walked with a Zombie weaves in other relationship complexities and a rich, respected Caribbean culture alien to Betsy, on its way to a downbeat ending open to interpretation. From the opening scene, Tourneur sets a tone to mystify and intrigue the viewer. Betsy draws us in with a light-heartedly wistful voiceover. I walked with a zombie. It does seem an odd thing to say. While her silhouette strolls along the beach with a very tall figure we presume to be him. This scene is never referenced again, suggesting it also served to box-tick that hideous title out of the way. Before we can dwell on this relationship, she is given a cursory interview for a nursing post that will take her to the exotic island of San Sebastian. She doesn't leap naively at the opportunity, and when knowledge of witchcraft is vaguely asked about, she claims ignorance facetiously. Once on the island, Betsy is gradually drip-fed its history, made up of a minority white ruling community and a happy deferential black majority, descended from the old slave trade. Straight away we note a radical and welcome difference in how Lewton and Tourneur depict the islanders' culture compared to Hollywood's usual portrayal of anyone dark-skinned. There is as much gentle respect accorded them as shown by them. The maid, Alma, Teresa Harris, is gracious and pleasant, without being a servile mammy stereotype spouting slang, much as she was allowed to be as Minnie the waitress in Cat People. Nor are the men relegated to grotesque pantomiming dimwits with outrageous cartoony voices. Even the musicians dress spotlessly in white suits and carry themselves with a serene dignity. As Betsy's suave English gent employer, Conway is well cast as Paul Holland. He has the air of languid privilege reminiscent of the British Raj, and an impassive coolness of manner that conceals a boiling, tormented passion. Likewise, his half-brother and mostly functioning alcoholic employee Wesley Rand, James Ellison, masks private pain. Before we peer into his sozzled soul, that night Betsy is distracted by plaintive weeping and goes to find the cause. The scene pulls back the discreet veil before which the household dissembles. Tourneur builds tension with a staircase tantalizingly lit by J. Roy Hunt, engulfing the top in shadows. Betsy is pursued by an ethereal woman in white who heads straight for her with a chilling, silent directness. It's a claustrophobic moment and shows what an unsettling camera effect can be achieved with simple, deliberate intent, devoid of any tricksiness. Fortunately, Betsy is saved by the appearance of Paul. This is an unforgettable way to introduce her to Jessica Holland, the woman she has been hired to look after. Betsy is told that Jessica's trance state is the result of a fever that damaged her spinal cord into a ruinous helplessness. She learns even more when drinking outside with Wesley. His "aw shucks" folksiness beguiles her until the unwitting calypso singer, the marvelously named Sir Lancelot, sings a lilting tune whose lyrics lay out Wesley's thwarted elopement with Jessica by Paul. Suddenly, Wesley turns from mushy to venomous, rounding on him for resurrecting the heartache Wesley medicates daily with booze. Betsy meets Mrs. Rand, a doctor and mother to the men, who is also not as straightforward as her friendly bedside manner. Playing the piano one evening, Paul reveals to Betsy a tenderness and self-critical fear that he feels responsible for his wife's state. Betsy is already falling for him. His confessional intensifies her anguish to the point where she sublimates it by promising to cure Jessica. From here onwards, Betsy becomes more than just a white colonial spectator as she ventures into the secluded world of voodoo ritual. Alma gives her and Jessica directions through the cornfield, and cloth brooches that function as all-access passes when they encounter the film's single yet fascinating zombie guardian. Our first sight of the towering Carrefour, Darby Jones, shot from below and lit by moonlight, is an unforgettably potent sight. His glazed-eyed guardian symbolizes the gateway for Betsy into the supernatural, if she dares. Despite his size, he offers no active threat, but neither can his calm stance be taken for granted either. Coupled with the sighing wind amid the high corn rows dwarfing Betsy and Jessica, this no-going-back sequence staged by Tourneur is thick with atmospheric foreboding. The arcane practices choreographed at the Home Fort worshipping site are mesmerizing and utterly credible. The sabreur wielding a sword's ceremonial power, the two dancers' jagged thrusts before meeting their foreheads over the drummer, plus the insistent earworm incantations driven by the beating heart of drumming. Images like these have a fierce, eerie commitment, far removed from the dodgy Hollywood choreography typically passed off as exotic rites in horror movies. What follows, though, reveals that actually even the preserved mystery of the locals has been deviously claimed by the white colonial settlers, masked as being for their betterment. Mrs. Rand has been posing as a voodoo priestess to dispense modern medicine under the guise of serving the gods. She tells Betsy that Jessica is beyond salvation. Meanwhile, the sabreur conducts his own occult tests. He pierces her arm with the sword, convincing the attending folk that she is a zombie. This prompts the ancient world to impact on the sanctity of the present in return when Carrefour is sent to collect Jessica for their further examination. The formidable Mrs. Rand denies him, and then fuels further ambiguous mystery by springing on Betsy that she believes she was a possessed conduit for a voodoo god who cursed Jessica into zombification. To further muddy the swirling dark waters, Wesley and the sabreur both duel over the soul of Jessica, the latter enacting the piercing of a voodoo doll effigy of her, as the still love-struck Wesley stabs her with the symbolic arrow of T-Misery, Saint Sebastian. With Carrefour striding silently after him, Wesley sacrifices himself and Jessica in the sea. Wading out with her in his arms suggests a religious, almost baptismal ceremony to the sad reuniting of their ill-fated love. This mournful, poetic ending adds to the lingering enigma that aided the film's longevity. And let's not forget that opening, which now seemingly identifies Carrefour as Betsy's companion on the shore. But why? When? Where are they going? Such musings haunt the viewer, as though we've just awoken from an evocative yet unexplained fever dream. At a time when most horror pictures followed a routine plot, often wrapped up with unimaginative haste, I Walked with a Zombie resonates for its daring bid to obscure easy answers. I remember vividly the aftermath of seeing the Blair Witch Project in 1999 with a large group of friends at the cinema, and how the passionate debates about its own open, mysterious ending was a rare and wondrous antidote to forgettability. Val Lewton and Jacques Tourneur had already taken audiences to that delightfully maddening place decades before. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.